The morning my sister Miriam vanished, she was braiding her hair by the window. I was 7 years old, sitting on the edge of her bed with my feet dangling, watching her fingers move through that long, dark braid the way they always did, quick and certain, like she had done it 10,000 times because she had. It was December of 1960, the kind of cold that pressed against the glass and turned the fields outside gray and silver all at once. She was humming. Not loudly, just under her breath, the way she always did when she was thinking about something far away from wherever she was standing. She looked at me in the little oval mirror above her dresser, and she smiled. And I remember thinking she was the most beautiful person I had ever seen in my life, which she was. She was 22 years old. Her wedding dress, plain and deep blue the way all Amish wedding dresses are, was hanging on the back of the door waiting for her. 300 guests were already on their way in their black buggies, the horse's breath rising in clouds against the cold December air. The groom, a man named Eli Troyer, was 26 years old, with a dairy farm and 80 acres, and a name that made the men in our district nod slowly when it was spoken. The kind of nod that means a thing has been settled and settled well. My parents had been preparing for this day for months. My mother had cooked for 3 days straight. The whole house smelled of roasting chicken and coffee, and the sweet heaviness of dried fruit pies, lined up on every flat surface in the kitchen. My father had scrubbed the barn floor until it shone. And yet 4 hours after I sat on that bed, watching Miriam braid her hair, she was gone, her dress still on the door, her good prayer cap still folded on the nightstand, her black shoes still sitting side by side beneath the window, which was open just wide enough to let the cold air move the curtain. And my sister was nowhere. The men searched the fields. They searched the pond. They searched the woods that ran along the back of our property, calling her name until their voices went hoarse. By noon, 300 guests had eaten the wedding meal in a silence so heavy it pressed down on all of us like weather, and then they went home. By evening, my mother had folded Miriam's wedding dress into a cedar chest in the attic, and that was the last time her name was spoken in our house with any gentleness at all. After that, her name became a wound. You could feel it in the room whenever someone nearly said it by accident. You could see it in the way my father's jaw would tighten at the supper table, in the way my mother would look down at her hands and go very still, and then begin talking about something else, something far away from the thing that had just almost been said. The community talked the way small communities always talk, sideways and in pieces, in the space between one woman and the next, at a quilting frolic, in a single lowered sentence at a barn raising. Some said Miriam had run off with an English man she'd been seen talking to in town. Some said she'd lost her mind with nerves. The cruelest ones said she had shamed her family deliberately, that there was a selfishness in her that had always been there if you knew where to look. Eli Troyer married a girl from a neighboring district 14 months later and was never heard to speak Miriam's name again. And I grew up carrying the shape of her in my chest, like a stone I could not put down. I left the Amish when I was 26. I was shunned. My letters were returned unopened. My mother died in 1989, and we had not spoken in 3 years by then. My father followed her 2 years after. I learned to drive. I enrolled in night school at 40. I built a life outside the plain world, piece by piece, the way you build anything when you start with almost nothing, slowly, and with a great deal of quiet stubbornness. I married a good man. I had children. And I told my children about their aunt, the one who had disappeared on her wedding day in December of 1960, the one whose name had been buried alive in our family long before anyone in it had died. I told them because I believe that a name deserves to be spoken, even if the speaking of it costs you something. And then, 5 years ago, when I was 65 years old, my youngest daughter came to me on a Sunday afternoon with her laptop open and her hands shaking slightly. And she said, "I think I found her." There was a woman in Indiana. Her name was listed as Mary, not Miriam, but the birth year was right. And the DNA match on the genealogy site said she was my full sister. My daughter had already sent a message. The woman had already responded. She said she had been hoping someone would find her for a very long time. I sat at my kitchen table and could not move for nearly an hour. And then I picked up the phone. Her voice was older. Of course it was. 65 years is a long time. Long enough to change the sound of a person almost completely. But underneath it, somewhere underneath the years and the distance and the life she had lived without me, I could still hear her. The very first thing she said was my name. Just my name, nothing else. And I came apart entirely. We talked for 4 hours that first afternoon, and she told me everything. And I want to tell you now what I learned, because it is the thing that changes the entire story of her disappearance. The thing that turned what had looked like abandonment into something else entirely. Eli Troyer, the man with the 80 acres and the good name, and the nod of approval from every man in the district, had not been who he appeared to be. During the courting year, during the bundling visits when he came to her room, and her parents slept down the hall, he had not respected any of the boundaries those visits were supposed to honor. He had told her, when she tried to refuse him, that she was already promised to him before God, and that a promise before God could not be withdrawn. She had tried to tell her mother. Her mother had told her that a good Amish girl did not bring such things into the light, and that marriage would correct whatever needed correcting. She had tried once carefully to hint at it to the bishop's wife. The bishop's wife had told her to pray more and trust that God had placed her in her circumstances for a reason. 6 weeks before the wedding, Miriam discovered she was carrying a child, and she understood, with a clarity that must have been terrifying in its completeness, that if she stayed, every night of her life would be what those courting nights had been, and the child growing inside her would come of age inside the same walls and learn the same silence and inherit the same helplessness. So she did the only thing that had not been forbidden, the one door the Ordnung had forgotten to lock. On the morning of her wedding, while the house was loud with preparations, and no one was watching the window of her bedroom, she opened it. She climbed down the trellis my father had built years before for climbing roses. She walked 3 miles through the frozen fields to the edge of the district, where there was a phone, and she called a woman who ran a small fabric shop in the nearest town. A woman who had always spoken to her with a gentleness that no one in her own world had managed to offer in that final year. That woman drove her to a bus station without asking a single unnecessary question. Miriam had $9 in the pocket of her everyday dress. She rode the bus to Indiana. She had her daughter that following spring and named her Judith after our grandmother. She raised that daughter alone, working in a laundry, then a bakery, then eventually a small alterations shop she saved up enough to open herself. She read every book she could get her hands on from the public library, hundreds of them over the decades, the way someone reads when their education was stopped at the 8th grade. And they have spent the rest of their life making up for the loss. She never married. She never came back. She never wrote because she knew, with the kind of bone-deep knowing that comes from having grown up inside a system, that contact meant discovery, and discovery meant pressure and pressure, applied by enough people who believed they were acting in love, would crush her. So she was silent, and she let us believe whatever we needed to believe. And she paid for our peace with 65 years of her own. I flew to Indiana the month after that first phone call. She was 87 years old. I was 65. We sat at her kitchen table in the house she had lived in for 30 years, and we held each other's hands. And for a long time, neither of us said anything at all. Her daughter Judith, who is 64 now and has 3 children of her own, made us tea and left the room so we could be alone, with the 65 years sitting between us. Miriam passed away 8 months after that afternoon. I was with her at the end, or as close to with her as a phone line can make you. And her daughter held her hand, and I held my breath, and the whole quiet of her life settled around her, like the snow that had been falling outside, the window of her room that whole last week. I am 65 years old. I have carried the weight of my sister's disappearance for most of my life, and now I know what it actually was. It was not an abandonment. It was not madness. It was not the devil or selfishness, or the failure of faith that the whispers suggested for years. What looked like a woman running away was actually a woman climbing toward the only life she believed she and her child had any right to. She climbed out that window on a cold December morning in 1960 with $9 and no plan and nowhere to go. And she made a life out of those things. And she never stopped thinking of me. When her daughter went through her belongings after she passed, she found a small tin on the shelf above Miriam's bed. Inside it was a school photograph of me, taken the autumn before her wedding. I was 7 years old in that photograph. She had carried it for 65 years. If you have someone in your family whose name stopped being spoken, whose disappearance was explained with silence or with cruelty, or with the kind of vague shame that doesn't name itself, please know this. The silence was almost never theirs. It was the system's. My sister Miriam did not abandon us. She saved her own life and her daughter's life. and she paid a price for it that I would not wish on anyone. But she paid it freely, and she would pay it again. And if you are standing somewhere right now, feeling like the only door available to you is a window, remember her. Remember that she made it. Remember that 65 years later, someone found her. Remember that it is never too late to be known.